Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Humanitarian Affairs Africa podcast. And before I continue, honestly speaking, I really want to take this opportunity to thank all of you who have supported the first episode, which was basically looking at the humanitarian crisis across Africa. And for that particular reason, a special thanks to you who basically liked, subscribed, or even shared a post on our YouTube or Spotify channels, and of course on all the social media channels. And if you have not yet done that, please, this is the time. Just pause for a second, search Humanitarian Affairs Africa podcast, and make sure that you subscribe because there is so much more in store this year for you. As we continue on this particular podcast, and I've gotten lots of feedback, and people are telling me, look, Alex, you talk about Africa and you talk about the humanitarian situation in Africa, but why don't you talk about why are Africans moving across Africa and out of Africa? And is it true that Africans are moving out of Africa and the desire of most people is to move out of Africa? And that is the particular reason why this particular episode 2 of our podcast, is going to focus on the migration patterns and trends across Africa. Is it changing? What is new? What are we seeing? And what exactly is in store for the future of Africa and migration? And to start us off is just to reflect on the major question that people always ask. What exactly is migration? What are the legal pathways for migration? And when you say legal pathways, does it mean that they are irregular, illegal pathways? Does that make people illegal if they move irregularly across Africa or out of Africa? Those are the questions we'll be exploring in the next bit of our segment, because Africa has always been on the move. From days of our forefathers to today to the future, Africa will always be on the move. And that's exactly why we need to look at the migration patterns and trends of Africa in 2026. So on the very first aspect is the question on where are Africans moving to and how many Africans are moving. Now, you will be interested to know that statistics from the International Organization for Migration indicate that over 50 million people who are born in Africa live outside of their country of birth. So that is the first thing that we need to actually reflect on. To put it to context, it just means that it's like the entire population of Kenya. Kenya has about 50 million people, and almost the entire population is living out of the country where they were born in Africa. So that already should tell you how much of Africans are moving across this great continent. Now, the question then comes in, where are they going to? And there's always been the notion that Africans are migrating more to the north, and we mean to the United States, to Europe, to the Gulf states in Asia. But in reality, you will be shocked to know that 80% of Africans who are migrating to other countries are not moving out of Africa. They are actually moving inside Africa, from one African state to the other. Just like in the olden days, brotherhood, sisterhood, I can come from my place and come to your place. And that's the same pattern. So we need to demystify the fact that people think generally that Africans have been moving out of Africa. If anything, maybe we should consider to say that it's been the reverse. People coming into Africa. That should probably be the next episode. But for now, let's look at the statistics. You'll basically ask me, what is migration, basically? And looking at the context of migration, I would want to give it a very simple definition as reflected by the International Organization for Migration, and also looking at the African Union definition of migration, which basically talks about movement of people from one place to the other, from one state to the other, or even within that particular state. So if I'm in Nigeria and I move from Abuja to Lagos, that actually is migration. And if I am, for example, I'm somewhere in South Africa and I move from Durban and I move all the way to Johannesburg, that is migration. Or in Somaliland, Hargeisa to Burma, that is migration. But at the same time, if I moved from Egypt and came all the way to the Democratic Republic of Congo, that is also migration. So it could mean then that migration happens on two levels, within a state, but also out of a state. And as you're reflecting on that, then you'll ask me then, why are people moving and why should people move and why are Africans moving? So I look at two main elements. One, we say regular migration. And regular migration basically means people moving along the legal pathways that have been set between one country to the other, or even regionally, for example, in the West African region under ECOWAS, or in the East African region under the East African Community. And this will basically be as a student, you're going to study. For example, if I want to go and study in Makerere University in Uganda, that is a regular pathway. I could actually be needing to study, or rather to go and take a job in South Africa, for example, in Durban or Limpopo. That is actually part of a regular migration pattern, because I will definitely go through the processes, whether it's there is a visa required, I need to register, I need to get the necessary work permits across those countries. And so definitely that is a regular migration pattern. I could also be moving regularly because I have a family who is on the other side. For example, if I'm in Kenya and there's a family member in Angola, for example, and I need to go and be reunified with them, then that is also one of the regular migration pathways. And sometimes, so basically you'll be looking at student visas, labor movements, family reunifications, or even for trade across this particular region. That is the first element on why people move on regular migration pathways. The second element is what we call irregular migration pathways. So these are movements that are normally outside of the legally provided pathways or mechanisms for people to move across one state to the other. In normal cases, it doesn't happen within the same country. So it will mean then that an irregular migration pathway would often happen from one border and crossing on to the other one, or crossing through several international territories, especially within African boundaries, and to the other one. And in that particular context, then it means then that sometimes irregular migration pathways start from within the same country and then also, of course, ends up in a different state. And how do we see that happening across Africa? Now, they happen through smugglers. So we actually have people who support other people to join and to come into another country or to move out of a certain country by what we'll basically refer in international law we call as smuggling. Then we also have very dangerous route, for example, where people actually move across the ocean, across the sea, and trying to cross over to the other side, and avoiding the territories or the border patrols within these particular countries. That also constitutes an irregular particular pathway. And unfortunately, under irregular pathways, there are a lot of exploitations. For example, human trafficking thrives in such pathways. We also have serious danger to life of the particular persons who are moving, and potential abuse and also diseases that actually happen, or rather these particular people face. So just to note on this particular point, irregular pathways do not make the people illegal, because, we do not have an illegal person. So irregular pathways are just irregular pathways. They're using illegal means of getting into one country. But particularly, it does not make the particular human being become illegal. So this is where I say we don't have illegal migrants. That term does not exist, because how can a human being be illegal? But be it as it may, as we speak right now, there are millions of people who have actually tried to cross from Northern Africa through the Mediterranean Ocean. And actually, the International Organization for Migration reports that thousands of them have actually lost their lives because these, as I said, are irregular pathways of movements. So with that background on what migration looks like and what are the regular and irregular pathways of migration, we now ask ourselves a major interesting question, whether migration patterns are changing across Africa. Are we seeing new trends, new patterns, new directions? Yes, definitely we are seeing that, basically in form, in direction, and reasons for people migrating. Just to give you a little bit of context, is that countries like in the South Africa actually hosts one of the highest numbers of migrants in Africa. We're talking about 5 million migrants actually who live in South Africa, and they come from all over the world, and majorly from neighboring countries, for example, in Zimbabwe, for example, Malawi. We're also talking about some all the way from Mozambique and also Namibia. And majorly most of them have gone there specifically on regular pathways. So they are going there to seek work, they're going there because their family members are there, they're going there for study. But the deviation is a bit wide in South Africa because we say that it's about 1.5 to 5 million according to IOM. And this is simply because that data in most cases starts as regular pathways and eventually end up being irregular because some people overstay and then have their work permits expired, or even their entry permits expired, although some of them also migrate through the borders, like from Zimbabwe to South Africa, specifically on irregular pathways seeking employment within South Africa. So South Africa actually is one of the countries in Africa that hosts the highest number of migrants from Africa and also from abroad. The other interesting bit that maybe most of you would not know, right now Uganda is considered as a very strict country. By the way, the other day they had their internet shut down. So the country was literally in a total blackout simply because there were elections in that country, and not so good. Right now, you would not tell me that there is an African who thinks highly of Uganda, especially politically speaking. But Uganda is actually considered as one of the kindest, most generous countries in Africa. And this is because as we speak right now, Uganda is actually new home to over 1.5 million refugees. This is actually the highest per capita in Africa, as we basically speak. And this is according to UNHCR data by mid of 2025, around June last year. And we actually say that Uganda is hosting the highest number of refugees in Africa. And so in the previous episode, you'll actually realize that we talked about these, and we actually talked about where these refugees are coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from South Sudan, some are coming from Burundi. And Uganda has always had an open door policy for refugees. But this is already putting a strain on the socioeconomic resources. You're talking about infrastructure in that particular country. But they have not said no. Uganda has continuously welcomed more refugees from across this great continent. And Kenya actually is the other country that hosts refugees, has two main refugee camps in Kakuma, which is towards the border with Ethiopia, South Sudan, and also Uganda towards the north. But at the same time, it has the Dadaab refugee camp, which is also one of the largest refugee camps in the world. And basically, it's been hosting refugees coming from different countries, also towards the border with Somalia, towards the border with Ethiopia. And so in Garissa, basically, that's where it's located. And so Kenya has about a population of about 550,000 refugees, according to UNHCR. And this is not quite higher than what Ethiopia actually has. Now, while we might be having people moving from Ethiopia, especially the Tigray region, to the other countries, Ethiopia also hosts about 900,000 to 1 million refugees coming from different countries. You will understand that Ethiopia is literally in between some of the countries that have been unstable for quite some time. Talking about Sudan, talking about South Sudan itself, Djibouti, Eritrea, and Somalia, of course, the Somaliland area on that context. So Ethiopia has also been one of the most welcoming countries in the world. If you didn't know, by the way, Ethiopia is the only African country that was never colonized. And so they have continued to be one of the areas that, one of the countries that people have always gone to in case they need help, in case they need assistance. Now, on a secondary level, it's also very important to note that there is actually a certain movement pattern as well in the West, where we are seeing persons moving from the Sahel region, from West African region, and trying to cross over to, these countries, they're formerly called Turkey or Turkey today. We are seeing a lot of people going to those countries. We're also seeing a lot of people going to the Gulf states, and also some of them make their way to Europe, especially from the West African countries. So the biggest question then comes in: who exactly is moving? Why are they moving? And what are the drivers of these particular movements? And so we will be able to discuss this on this particular episode. But one of the things that we have to note is that the migration trends are definitely changing. And one of the things that is actually causing it is we're talking about armed conflict situations, the insecurity situation across some of the African countries as we're speaking. We're also talking about the climate change. For a second, try and get more information and find out what's happening in the Horn of Africa right now because of the drought situation in South Africa, in Sudan, in Somalia, and largely also Kenya and also parts of Ethiopia. So that is basically part of the reasons why Africa's migration trends are changing, and that's what's new in the African continent. So we already know that there are regular and irregular migration patterns, and Africans are moving intra-Africa, meaning from one African country to the other. For example, there is an arrangement in the East African community, that is Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and lately the newest entry is Somalia, that we have visa-free entry, and that means we should be able to move freely across the East African community. And the same arrangement also exists in the West under the Economic Community for West African States of over 15 member states, and they also have visa-free sort of movements across these particular countries. So that has actually facilitated more movement for trade, movements for education, family unification, and even just exploration, people just trying to get to understand what's happening across the neighbor, in the neighbor's home yard. But at the same time, it's also important to note that there have been very many irregular movements across Africa. And so we actually start with the north, and we actually know that there is a movement of people that has been happening, and especially from the Sahel region, the transit area, where there are people moving from countries like Mali because of the political instability, like Burkina Faso, and most of them go through countries like Libya and then try to find their way to the sea. That's the Mediterranean Sea as well. But we also have some of the movements from the Red Sea and Gulf routes. So, for example, you look at the region within Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti, we're actually seeing a lot of movements of people from that particular area trying to cross over through the Red Sea and go all the way to the Gulf states like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and many other countries, Qatar, and we are seeing a lot of these particular movements in this country, in this context. Then we also have certain movements that are happening just across the Sahara and Central Mediterranean Sea, and we are seeing actually, it's reported that over 25,000 people have actually died in the last decade, according to IOM, trying to cross in the Mediterranean Sea and trying to find that tiny island. There is a tiny island in the Mediterranean Sea which apparently belongs to the state of Spain, and that is where most people actually try to get there. And the reason why people actually swim across this particular ocean, just to get to context, is, remember, according to international law, is that as long as someone is trying to access your boundaries or your territory from the sea, then you're actually required to help them in, whether regular or irregular. And actually what would happen with most people is that as they get to the northern parts of Africa, maybe through Libya, they would actually try to swim. So they will actually get into boats. Some of them are not very stable boats that are actually used to swim across the Mediterranean Ocean. And they will not be seeking to get to Europe as in the larger continent. They'll actually try to access a small island, which is a territory of Spain. You see what I mean? And once they are there, then it's the mandate. Spain is actually required. Spain and Italy, who also actually have islands belonging to them in the Mediterranean Sea, they are actually required to help them, provide assistance to people who are stuck at sea, and most potentially allow them. And this is where, remember when I mentioned something called non-refoulement, where you're not expected to return back people who are trying to seek help into your country. It also applies to persons in terms of international law of the sea. And so that is why most African communities, most African young people are trying to swim across the ocean and get just on that particular island. And once they're there, then they know that help will be coming. Of course, you have seen a lot of pushbacks coming in, people breaking international law, the European countries working with some of the North African countries to try and stop and reduce those movements. But we are consistently seeing people taking dangerous routes. So with this basic understanding of migration patterns and what have you across Africa, we ask ourselves, why is this important for us, and especially for you and I, who has a keen interest in humanitarian affairs across Africa and the human rights context to it? And we want to look at that, one, for three main groups. One, we want to look at it from the lens of humanitarian assistance and also humanitarian aid workers. We'll also look at it from the community's perspective, and also look at it from the policy makers' perspective. Now, for humanitarian assistance, this basically means, because we're saying more people are migrating in Africa, Some of them are moving through the regular pathways, some of them are moving through irregular pathways. And we're also seeing that there is a disproportionate burden put on certain countries like Uganda that hosts about 1.5 million refugees currently to try and accommodate this. So it basically means when we are going to talk about humanitarian assistance in 2026 and the coming years in Africa, in context to migration, we have to keep in mind what we call mixed migration movements. And mixed migration, then that means not everybody who's trying to cross a border are going there for the same reasons. You might find a group of people, someone is actually running because they have fear of persecution from their country as an asylum seeker. Some of them are actually trying just to move because they want to get better opportunities in another country. Some of them are moving because they want to get, for example, education or even seeking medical attention in another country within the African continent. And so when we see these groups of people, it's important to understand what exactly are their reasons why they are moving. Because within these groups, we have women, we have children, we have persons with disability, we have also the elderly who are also within these particular groups. And so it's important as we are planning humanitarian assistance, it has to be integrated. It has to look at all the protection aspects, looking at the vulnerable groups within these particular mixed movements context. And so when we are going to assist, for example, like what's happening in Uganda, then it means that they have to look at food security context, we have to look at medical care, we have to look at safety and security for those particular people. We also have to look at things like shelter and basic needs, even for children, like education and mental health and counseling, basically. So that is the most important context on why humanitarian workers and aid assistants have to consider the migration patterns that are happening across and within Africa. The second group of people that I need to talk to today are communities generally across Africa. Now, you will be shocked to know that the number of people who actually sent back money from abroad to their countries in Africa are actually so high that it's estimated to be over 60 billion US dollars worth of remittances. So remittances are basically money that, for example, if I went to South Africa today and lived there and I'm earning from there, so the money I send back to my family in Kenya, that's actually one of the things that we call remittances. And of course, this is normally picked by the government as well. And so the value of that amount of money basically has been estimated to be over 60 billion US dollars in the recent years. This is the interesting fact. It is more than the amount of money Africa has gotten as aid and donation from the countries in the West. Yeah. So it means we can possibly fund our own aspects if we allow for regular pathways for Africans to move and access opportunities within our own continent. And that will actually be more than even the aid assistance that we have gotten. 60 billion US dollars is quite an amount of money, considering that this is just being sent by Africans in different countries. So when you see someone coming to your community, please welcome them. As long as they do not pose a danger to you or your family, they're just seeking better opportunities, they're seeking help. Be friendly, because that is our African culture. They are basically trying to get things better for their own people back at home. And this last group of people that I need to talk to are the policy makers, the decision makers. If you're working in government, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Internal Security Coordination, Ministry of Defense, all those people working in the immigration departments, and even those who are representatives of different countries into the African Union, for example, where we have, for example, the migration policy and framework for Africa 2018 to 2030. So basically, that particular framework allows for people to move freely across Africa, and it actually talks about human rights-centered approach in migration. So we need to continuously make more policies that allow people to move freely, because when you stop regular pathways, when we do not have people allowed to move freely through visa-free spaces, then it actually means that the irregular pathways become more. So if you stop people from getting the visa of your own country to come to your country, it means they look for other ways which are more dangerous, more riskier, and that will actually cause more harm than good. So let's be brotherly. Make policies that allow for free movement across Africa, whether as a student, whether you're coming in for work, whether you're coming in to seek better opportunities, reuniting with your family, or even for leisure. We saw exactly what HA+A did to the space in Africa, where we actually got to see which African countries we should be visiting. I don't know from your perspective, which African country will you be visiting from the ones that HA+A visited? last couple of months. So, as we finalize this conversation, the question then comes in, where is the migration patterns and what exactly for Africa's future in terms of migration? And I'll tell you three main things that's going to happen. The United Nations Department for Economic and Social Affairs predicts that Africa's population, especially the work-ready population, is going to grow by 450 million by 2030. So it means there'll be more people moving around seeking opportunities, the age working population, which of course, majority of whom are actually young people across Africa below the age of 35. Now, the second thing is that the remittances from Africans who are living abroad. Remember we say that over 50 million Africans are living out of their countries of birth. So these remittances, that money that they send back to their country, is going to increase, especially because the continent is becoming more and more connected with technology, is becoming more and more connected with things like M-Pesa, mobile money transactions. So remittances are going to increase across Africa, which is a good thing, a positive thing for migration. But on the flip side, we're also going to see climate shocks are actually going to force more people to be displaced. And this is this is just to make the situation worse, especially for countries that actually have a bit of an instability as we speak, like Sudan, where the conflict is still going on. And so we're going to see more people moving because of these particular situations. So Africa's migration is not a crisis of numbers. It's a story of people seeking better opportunities, movements for opportunities, movements for better spaces. And so we are going to see more migration. So migration is not just an aspect, it's not an outlier in Africa's story. It is part and parcel of Africa's future. So what are some of the things you think that we should be able to talk about? What migration patterns have you seen? Or are you one actually? Did you move out of Africa? Tell us what were your reasons for moving and tell us why you think Africa should be ready for migration.